Welcome to part 2 of our geography video. In our last video, we got an intro to geography, some of the elements on maps. We ended up with scale. I want to continue with maps. I want to talk today about latitude and longitude. Lines of latitude are sometimes called parallels because each one is parallel to the other. Each line is also the same distance from each other. The equator is an example of this. It's the most famous example. It is at 0 degrees. Lines of latitude are horizontal. See if the camera gets me doing this. And so this is where people sometimes get confused because although they're horizontal around the Earth, they're measured north and south of the equator. So the equator is at 0 degrees. It does not have a label, it's just 0 degrees. So, for example, 0 degrees. The North Pole is at 90 degrees north. The South Pole is at 90 degrees south. Longitude goes north to south. In other words, lines of longitudes go from the North Pole to the South Pole like this. And again, ignore the horizontal artifacts. That's because PowerPoint is awful and doesn't let you draw well. um, so again, lines of longitude start at the North Pole and then they go vertically around the surface of the Earth to the South Pole. The distance between those lines decreases as one nears a north or a south pole. In other words, they aren't the same. They are not parallel lines. Lines of longitude are measured east and west from the prime meridian. Prime here means first or most important. The prime meridian goes to the Royal Observatory at Greenwich, England. This is entirely a political reason. This was determined in I believe in the late 1800s. I may have maybe a few decades off. This is at the height of European imperialism when Britain was the major imperial power. Um, at different points, people had thought that it should be through other areas, typically around the Mediterranean. So Egypt was used as an example for some. I think Spain might have been there. There were lots of possibilities. The opposite side of the Earth, it goes through the international dateline, or where the international dateline would be if it weren't crooked. By treaty, the international dateline is crooked to allow territories of countries to remain in on the same day as the rest of that country. So if you look at the globe or you look at a map of the international dateline that goes through the Pacific Ocean, you'll see it's not a straight line. If it were a straight line, that straight line was at 180 degrees. There's two types of location we talk about in geography. One is absolute location, and absolute location is measured by latitude and longitude. Latitude and longitude are both measured in degrees, and then typically in minutes and seconds. There are 60 minutes in a degree, and there are 60 seconds in a minute. They can also be measured as decimals, starting with the degree, and then the decimal part relates to the minutes and the seconds. That involves converting them first into fractions and those fractions into decimals. That is a little it's not really complicated, but there's some steps involved. We aren't going to worry about that. You would not worry about that in elementary school. You might if you taught geography in middle school eventually someday. And the location always starts with latitude, so degrees north or south of the equator, and then longitude, degrees east or west that should say of the prime meridian. For example, in Bemidji, Minnesota, the absolute location is approximately, not worried about minutes or seconds, approximately 47 degrees north, 95 degrees west. In other words, 47 degrees north of the equator, 95 degrees west of the prime meridian. The North Pole is at 90 degrees north. And so what this tells us, right, is that Bemidji is just a little more than halfway between the North Pole and the equator. So if we were 2 degrees further south, it would be halfway between the North Pole and the equator. It's North Pole 90 degrees north, South Pole 90 degrees south, prime meridian 0 degrees. international date line 180 degrees. And again, Bemidji is kind of centrally located. It is almost halfway between the prime meridian and the international date line. If it were 5 degrees further to the east, it would be halfway. These absolute location lines are why some lines on maps are so straight, because some borders are tied to latitude lines. Um, Latitude more often than longitude. That is why the border between the U.S. and Canada, from Minnesota to Washington State, is where it is. It is why some of the state boundaries in the U.S. are where they are. Those are tied to lines of latitude. So that's absolute location. Relative location is where something is compared to somewhere else, or where somewhere is relatively to somewhere else. So we could say, for example, that Canada is north of the United States, that Louisiana is east of Texas. We use relative location all the time when giving directions to people, particularly before there was GPS. My house is 2 doors down from the Purple House. Go to the second stop sign on the street and turn left. After the yellow house, turn right. Those are all examples of relative location. Um, Duluth is north of Minneapolis, St. Paul, roughly speaking. Relative location. There are officially in American geography 7 continents: Africa, Antarctica. Notice that there is a sea in Antarctica. Asia, Australia, Europe, North America, South America. Some geographers do prefer to say Eurasia rather than Europe and Asia, because there's not really a clear physical divide between those continents. Traditionally, the Ural Mountains were said to be the dividing point, but the Urals are not really a huge mountain range. Um, they are less impressive by far than the Rockies, but we don't divide North America between west of the Rockies and east of the Rockies officially as different continents. They are much less impressive than the Himalayas, but although we talk about the subcontinent of India, um, that is pushing north into Asia, which is what's causing the Himalayas to increase in size. We don't talk about India as being a completely separate continent, and so some geographers do talk about Eurasia rather than Europe and Asia as separate continents. Sometimes you'll hear Oceania used, which I'm probably pronouncing wrong. That is sometimes used instead of Australia to refer to Australia and other islands in the Pacific Ocean. Every so often, you might hear something about another continent. I think a few years ago, geographers said, or at least a geographer said, well, if we're looking at satellite imagery, really there's a continental plate under, I believe, under New Zealand that includes it and many of the Pacific Islands. And so that really should be a continent, Zealandia or something like that. That has not been widely accepted. There's also 5 oceans. This might come as a surprise to a few people. There's the Arctic. And again, please notice the spelling of Arctic. This is one of my pet peeves. It's okay if, misspelling happens, but this is a word you should be able to spell as an educator. Arctic has 2 C's in it. We usually pronounce it Arctic. Like I usually say Arctic, and I don't pronounce that middle C. There's probably reasons linguistically why most people don't pronounce that middle C, but there is a C in the word. And so it is Arctic, Arctic, not Artic. Um, and so there's then, of course, the Atlantic, the Indian, the Pacific, and the Southern. And the Southern is what might confuse some people. The Southern Ocean is sort of the newest ocean, according to geographers, newest in terms of its being recognized as an ocean. On older maps and globes before 2000 or so, the Southern Ocean was not indicated. It was just considered part of either the Atlantic or the Pacific or the Indian, depending upon where the world you were. But in reality, my understanding is that the Southern Ocean actually does show some really clear, like there is sort of an ocean boundary because it has to do with how waters flow and currents and stuff like that. So there is now considered to be a Southern Ocean. You can think of it as the companion of the Arctic, just as the Arctic is around the North Pole. The Southern is around Antarctica, which of course surrounds the South Pole. Remember that Antarctica is a continent. The South Pole is in the middle of roughly in the middle of the continent of Antarctica. The North Pole is not on a continent, and the Arctic Ocean traditionally was ice for much of the year. Um, that has changed recently, but so the North Pole is in the middle of an ocean. It is not on land, unlike the South Pole. A hemisphere is half of a sphere. Of course, we can divide the world different ways. We can look at the northern, the southern hemisphere. We can look at the eastern and the western hemispheres. Note, technically, if we are looking at the prime meridian as the dividing line between eastern and western hemispheres, that means that a little bit of Europe and a little bit of Africa are actually part of the western hemisphere because they are west of the prime meridian. That includes places like Spain and Portugal, and again parts of northwest Africa, like Morocco and Mauritania, Senegal and Gambia are all west of that. By convention, that's considered part of the eastern hemisphere, though. Most of the Earth's population is in the northern hemisphere, and most of the Earth's population is in the eastern hemisphere. And that's because Asia is in the northern and the eastern hemispheres, and Asia is the most populated continent on Earth. A little bit of the physical geography aspect now in solstices. The Tropic of Cancer is at 23.5 degrees north. You can see that on a map or globe. And this is the northernmost direct point of sunlight. In other words, this is where sunlight will hit the Earth perpendicularly. Essentially, it will. Earth is here, sunlight is coming straight down, or Earth is here, sunlight is coming straight that way. Um, this occurs around June 22nd at summer solstice. The Tropic of Capricorn is the southernmost point, same thing, southernmost point of direct sunlight. This occurs winter solstice at December 22nd. And of course, the seasons here are from a northern hemisphere perspective. Those seasons are swapped in the southern hemisphere, where the northern hemisphere is winter, December, January, February is summer in the southern hemisphere, and vice versa. Equinoxes occur when a sun shines directly on the equator, again, a direct perpendicular sunlight. The autumn or autumnal or fall equinox is approximately September 22nd. That does change a day or two from year to year. It goes back and forth, I believe, between days. The vernal or spring equinox is approximately March 23rd. Again, those seasons are swapped in the southern hemisphere. When it's fall in Minnesota, it is spring in Zimbabwe, and vice versa. If you're interested in seasons, there is a YouTube video you can watch, or you can just go to YouTube and look at seasons. There's lots of good videos that show that. Please note that Earth is actually closer to the sun during winter in the northern hemisphere. It's winter because the northern hemisphere is tilted away from the sun, not because Earth is farther from the sun. In fact, Earth is farther from the sun during summer in the northern hemisphere. It's summer because the northern hemisphere is tilted toward the sun. This is also why summer in the southern hemisphere tends to be warmer than summer in the northern hemisphere. But local climates are affected by a variety of factors. That includes local elevation. It includes bodies of water. So if you're from northern Minnesota, you've probably heard about things like Colder by Lake Superior. Bodies of water both heat up and cool down more slowly than surrounding land areas. And so Lake Superior takes longer to warm up in the summer. So in summer, it is often cooler, significantly cooler by Lake Superior. Similarly, in winter, Lake Superior takes longer to cool off than the land does. So it is warmer by the lake very often, particularly for the first part of winter. Obviously, bodies of water also cause local precipitation. We call that lake effect snow in winter, for example. Um, Continentality is something that's present in North America. It's also present in Asia. This is that idea that areas that are far away from large bodies of water are more likely to have extreme weather. That is true, for example, in the Great Plains of the U.S. and particularly in the western Dakotas, in western Nebraska and western Kansas. These are places that are far away from both the Atlantic and the Pacific. They are relatively far away from the Gulf of Mexico. They are far away from the Arctic Ocean. Um, there is more likely to be extreme weather in those regions. The North Atlantic Current or North Atlantic Drift is a natural feature that takes warm water from around the Gulf of Mexico, or whatever you prefer to call it today, and moves it north towards northern Europe. This is one reason why Scandinavian countries, although they are further north than Minnesota, if we look at a globe, their weather is not as not as extremely cold in the winter as Minnesota is. Um, we know this among other things, like Scandinavian immigrants to the upper Midwest were shocked by how cold it got in Minnesota and the Dakotas in the winter. And we can see this a little bit on this map, um, that the this is average winter temperatures and in terms of northern hemisphere winters. And so if we take a look here, we can see that you notice that for example, southern Scandinavia is sort of at a medium dark green. That is a little bit. This map isn't ideal, but that's actually a little bit lighter, I believe, than the Upper Midwest is. Not a lot, but a little. It's more equivalent to Kansas, Missouri, Illinois, roughly. This is because of the North Atlantic Current. It makes this region much warmer than it would be. Notice that in terms of latitude, this is sort of central Canada, um, but it's much warmer than central Canada is, for example. This is a good place for us to stop. In our last video, we are just going to look at some other types of maps, but thanks for watching so far. If you have any questions, please let me know.